Coastal archaeology is rapidly changing our view of British history. As the tide goes out, it reveals vital clues to how our coastal communities lived and worked in the past.
The area exposed at low tide is called the Inter-tidal zone, and every day, for just a few hours, it reveals fresh archaeological evidence for us to explore. Ancient crossings, forgotten harbours, and intriguing broken-down structures like this one, all shedding light on the past.
But with every tide, this legacy is under threat. Rising sea levels, coastal erosion and storm surges are wiping away the evidence for future generations.
That's why we're visiting key sites around the country, investigating what's there and recording it before it disappears forever.
This week we're in Scotland, exploring the inner reaches of the Firth of Forth to find out what archaeological finds the tide has left behind. We've enlisted the help of our colleagues from SCAPE, the Scottish Coastal Archaeology Group. We'll be investigating the mystery of this long-forgotten harbour.
Kennetpans is regarded as the birthplace of the Scotch whisky industry.
We'll be trying to discover why a 16th century entrepreneur decided to tunnel under the sea.
What we're seeing here are the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, right beneath our feet.
And what about the remains of this pier? Why, in centuries past, was it so important to cross the Firth of Forth here?
It's stretched out over 3/4 of a mile.
3/4 of a mile, but not 3/4 of a mile up there, because that'd be a bridge.
At 55 miles long and 19 miles across at its widest point, the Firth of Forth is the largest estuary on Scotland's east coast. Its magnificent Victorian cantilevered railway bridge links Fife in the north with Lothian in the south. Ever since the 16th century, industry has flourished along the estuary's banks, helping to sustain important trades and pioneering new technologies. We are starting on the north side of the Forth, near Kincardine, where this largely forgotten harbour has silted up with mud.
A lovely spot here.
This is actually called Kennetpans, so you'd kind of imagine there should be a salt pan here or something like that.
Yeah, a bit mucky for that.
Can you see here, buried in the mud just there, there's a couple of pieces of timber, and they're sort of carrying on down. There's another one here, and then there's another one just here. It's as if there would have been a wharf or something like that, and I think that sort of mirrors what we're seeing on the other side.
This was a fairly substantial harbour with more than one wharf.
It's hard to imagine that now. It's so clogged up with mud.
There's all these crumbling buildings. A big one there, and then another massive, rather enigmatic and definitely somewhat broken down one over there.
We've been told by local people that the derelict buildings once housed a distillery.
It's all pointing to a harbour of some significance.
Tom and Charlotte are investigating the architecture of the harbour, and they're surprised by some of the materials they're finding.
Charlotte, can you see this stone wall?
Yes,
And this is part of the infrastructure for the harbour, and you can see the amount of work that's gone into building this. They put in the timbers and that stone wall, but behind it, can you see in there, there's some coal dust?
Oh, yeah.
What they've been doing is they've been raising the whole ground level up so that the boats can come in here. And then
Join it up with this.
Yeah, so you see our massive timbers here.
Yeah, they're huge, aren't they?
You can imagine the sort of decking coming all the way across there and going over to the land just there.
Yeah, so we'd actually be underneath this now, wouldn't we?
Yeah, but look at those ones over there as well. That is a huge amount of timbers. They're obviously expecting to use a lot of weight on there.
The harbour was formed where the mouth of a burn or stream, now hidden by the reeds, flows out into the Forth. Harbours like this struggle to stay clear of mud. They need some kind of mechanism, like a sluice, to flush out the build-up of silt.
I found the sluice. Oh, wow. Can you see just down the bottom there, there's actually a
a pipe.
Oh, yeah.
There had been a sluice gate there that would have held water back in this like reservoir holding pond. Then at low tide, they could have opened that gate and all that water could have rushed out, sluiced the harbour and flushed all the mud out. It's quite an intriguing structure. It seems to have been built originally out of lovely dressed sandstone blocks, but...
See those on either side, yeah.
Yeah, but it must have been remodelled sort of at least once, because there's also these rather less charismatic, great big concrete blocks.
It's interesting because the fact that you've got these beautiful dressed stone blocks implies that it was quite an early phase of the harbour that had a sluice in place, certainly a fair ways back.
But obviously, much later on, this sluice was still really important because they've been rebuilding it to keep the harbour working.
Well, you can see what happens without it.
Absolutely, all that Forth mud builds up and clogs the whole harbour.
The evidence from the sluice suggests the harbour has been rebuilt over many years. But just how old is it? Was it built for the distillery beside it? Or was the distillery here because there was already a harbour? And is Tom's discovery of coal dust significant? A few miles back towards the mouth of the Firth of Forth, Oliver is heading to the village and former royal borough of Kouros. Kouros is best known for its beautifully preserved 17th century buildings. But 400 metres off its shoreline, there's an enigma, a rocky outcrop that's only visible at low tide. To find out all about it, Oliver is wading into the mud in the company of archaeologists Joe Hambley and Douglas Spears.
What are we heading towards? The mound up there?
Well, Oliver, it doesn't look much from here, but this is in fact the remnants of a fantastically important 16th century coal mine.
It's the base of a coal mine.
Well, it's the very last place you would probably expect to find a coal mine, particularly at such an early date. This shaft probably being sunk about 1590, but that's exactly what it is.
This part of the estuary they're crossing was once rich with coal. But in the 16th century, when they didn't yet have much in the way of technology, how did they get to the coal under the sea?
What we're walking up to is certainly Britain's, possibly Europe's, first submarine coal mine.
Wow, that's incredible.
It was a shaft sunk through the seabed to connect to the mine just on land, a few hundred metres over to our right.
This cutting-edge shaft was known as a moat pit because at high tide it was surrounded by sea. As well as connecting with the mine on land, it also provided access to tunnels which stretched far out under the estuary.
This is what this site's all about, the actual mine shaft itself. So we're standing on the walls of the mine shaft.
How far was it going down here?
If we were to clear this out, about 40 feet below us, this would connect with the principal coal mine running underneath our feet.
And how far up would it go?
Well, our best estimates would put it probably somewhere about 10 metres, 30 feet high. So miners, men, women, children were going up and down the shaft. Baskets of coal were coming up and down it. So there would have been an awful lot of activity.
Putting a mine shaft in the estuary meant coal could now be loaded straight onto ships without having to transport it through a port.
So, Douglas, would ships have come right up against the superstructure, do you think?
Very much so. Coal could now be lifted directly out of the shaft, loaded onto waiting barges and boats, which were berthed right alongside the structure.
It's such an impressive achievement, but who was behind this?
The owner of this mine was a chap called George Bruce. He was an extraordinarily talented mining engineer and local industrialist. He was extracting coal to power the industry of the Upper Forth. So really and truly, what we're seeing here are the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in Britain.
Right beneath our feet.
Is indeed.
George Bruce's ingenuity enabled him to find a lucrative way to mine under the estuary and to meet the increasing demand for coal in the 16th century. But tunnelling under the sea was only half the challenge to the designers of this experimental mine. The next question was, how could they keep the miners safe and dry? We're leaving Kouros and heading to a site called Higgins Nook on the other side of the estuary. Crossing here was not always an easy feat. 3 major rivers feed into the Firth of Forth, and twice a day their strong currents do battle with the incoming tides. The narrowest part of the estuary is at Kincardine, an ancient ferry point, where today there are not 1 but 2 bridges.
Rather surprisingly, it wasn't until 1936 that this bridge, the Kincardine Bridge, was built. It was the first and for a long time only road bridge east of Stirling. Until then, if you wanted to avoid a 50-mile round trip, the only way to cross the river was by boat.
This is Higgins Nook on the south side of the estuary.
Is this the way?
Yes, yes, across here.
Ellie wants to show me some remains at the site of the ancient crossing.
Oh, wow. That's quite impressive.
Is it a pier?
It is, yes.
It's massive.
It was a pier for the Kincardine ferry that crossed the Forth here. It was the only crossing between Queensferry downriver and Stirling all the way upriver.
Oh, wow. So it was important, because that's like 20 miles that way to Queensferry, and it's a good 10 miles that way
Absolutely,
to
yes.
Stirling. So this was a major crossing point.
Yeah.
How old is it?
Well, there's been a ferry crossing here since at least the 14th century.
But that's not a 14th century pier.
No. This one was built at some point in the late 1820s.
It's big.
It stretched out actually over 3/4 of a mile.
3/4
the whole
of a mile.
thing, yes.
But not 3/4 mile up there, because that'd be a bridge. It wouldn't be a...
Absolutely, no. The whole thing stretched much further back that way behind us as well.
The pier had to be so long because of the notorious Forth mud, which built up and made it difficult to access the ferry from land.
You can look at a map, actually, that'll show just how big it had to be from further back behind us. So this is where we are. So you can see Kincardine Ferry. This was drawn in the 1820s for when this pier was built. And you can see here, they've actually called it the New Pier.
New pier?
Yeah.
That's intriguing.
Well, that's the thing. If we look just a little bit further over to the west, we've got 2 earlier piers.
Old stone pier and...
Line of old wooden pier.
That's 2 other old piers.
This is the 3rd pier that's been built here within this period, because there had been complaints from the 15th century onwards about the problems of actually accessing the ferry, people having to wade for 40 yards through the mud.
3 piers were built in the course of a decade, each one bigger than the last, to reach over the ever-increasing mud and provide access to the ferries at both high and low tides. Why, in a clearly difficult environment, was it so important to design more and more advanced piers and keep this ferry crossing open? After visiting the harbour at Kennetpans, we're now investigating when it first came into existence and whether it predates the buildings beside it. I've come to Edinburgh, to the National Library of Scotland, to see if its map collection can unlock the harbour's history. The library's map curator, Chris Fleet, has brought out some of his oldest maps for me to examine.
Oh, Chris, this is a beautiful map. How old is it?
This map dates from 1783, and it's a map by James Stobie of the whole of the counties of Perth and Clackmannanshire. And then I think Kennetpans is around about here.
Right by the shore, like on this little stream that's marked, there's a sort of circle with a dot and spokes around it. It looks like sort of like an eye.
Yes, yeah, that was the symbol that Stobie used for a mill.
Could this mill have been part of the distillery buildings that are now in ruins? At the very least, it suggests there was already a harbour at Kennetpans in 1783.
Can we push it any further back?
Well, we can. This map dates from around about 1681, and it's a map by John Adair. On the edge of the map, we kind of see Kennetpans.
Yeah, Kennetpans. What is that? Like marked on the Kennetpans shoreline? It sort of looks like a crane? Could it be a crane? It's got something sticking out and something dangling off it.
What we're looking at here is definitely a building. Whether it indicates any more than that is something that it would be difficult to say.
There's no mill there.
But there's no mill there.
That's interesting. But something was happening there.
Yeah.
Curiouser and curiouser.
Chris has one final map to show me. It's one of the library's finest treasures, the earliest cartographical depiction of Scotland.
This map is thought to date from around about 1590. It was drafted by a man called Timothy Pont, and this is one surviving fragment of his overall output.
It's just beautiful.
You can just pick out the name of Kennet.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because Kennet is not Kennetpans, because Kennet is that little settlement that's to the north.
Exactly.
And it's inland, and there's nothing. There isn't anything marked on the shore here. Does that mean there wasn't anything there? There was no harbour?
It is very unlikely. We can see that over on the other side of Erth, there are definitely a number of boats signifying an active harbour, which it was known to be. And the fact that it's not shown over on the other side of the Forth at Kennetpans is significant. So I think we're not looking at any evidence of a harbour at this time.
That's really, really interesting, because that kind of gives us a bit of a timeline. So there's nothing marked in 1590-ish, but 100 years later, there's a significant building right on the shoreline. So it's in that intervening period that everything changed at Kennetpans.
Yeah,
that's when
yeah.
things seem to have really taken off.
Yeah, I think that's certainly what the maps are showing us.
The maps tell us the harbour at Kennetpans must have come into existence sometime between 1590 and 1681. They also hint at some kind of industry that was there before the distillery. But what was it? Back in Kouros, Oliver is following up on the intriguing 16th century underwater mine shaft built by George Bruce. He's meeting archaeologist Donald Adamson, who's keen to show him another Bruce innovation. Not this time in the sea, but on the shore. It was essential to keep the moat pit working. At its height, there would have been at least 100 men, women and children working underneath the estuary, their lives all dependent on George Bruce's engineering.
He's got a shaft inland, he's got a shaft out at sea,
Okay.
and here we have another shaft. So this is the third shaft.
This is a ventilation shaft.
It is a ventilation shaft, but it's also there to drain the coal mine. It's an Egyptian wheel. It harks back to the Nile, to moving water. It's actually built to take water out of the coal mine, so it acts as a sump. And we have a chap called John Taylor, who was a poet. He comes to the mine in 1618, and I happen to have the account here. And what he actually says is that George Bruce has a device like a horse mill, that with 3 horses and a great chain of iron going downwards many fathoms with 36 buckets fastened to the chain, of which 18 ascend up to be emptied. That's what Taylor says.
I kind of want to see it in action myself after hearing that.
We have a nice picture here of how that works. So we have horses yoked to beams, pulling it round. We have the buckets coming down the chain, scooping the water up and then back up, and it turns into a chute and back into the sea.
Oh, it's an incredible system. It just keeps getting more amazing, the whole notion of building, mining out under the sea, and then, of course, this method of draining the mine.
First time in Britain, I think, at the period, and really wasn't seen at that level for a long time thereafter.
George Bruce's sea pit, together with his very advanced ventilation and drainage systems, made this an extraordinary example of Tudor industrial enterprise. It would be another 150 years before anyone attempted to imitate this technology. But at the same time as it was pioneering science, the region remained steeped in traditional beliefs.
All this industry and innovation creates a real sense of a progressive community embracing the future. But this was also an area that was bound in superstition.
The people here were devoutly religious. Their beliefs were Bible-based, and they believed in evil spirits. 2 miles east of Kouros is the village of Torryburn. On the beach, there is one particular stone that has an unusual history. For years, it lay unidentified in the Inter-tidal zone. Then, in 2014, Fife archaeologist Douglas Spears found what he had been looking for.
As you can see, this is a big bay with a lot of rocks, so we spent an awful lot of time actually studying each individual boulder and stone until we came across this stone in front of us.
Ah, how did you know this was the one?
This one's quite different. This stone is made of sandstone. It's a local sandstone, and you can see that it's been quarried. We've got a dimple mark here in the middle, so it's a completely alien rock. It's not natural to this environment.
This is the burial stone of Lilias Adie, who died in custody after being arrested for witchcraft in 1704.
What was it that made it so clear that this was Lilias's tombstone?
We knew from the historical record that the burial was below the sea mark, they said. So we knew we were looking in the intertidal zone. It's this strange liminal place. It's not quite land, but it's not quite sea.
She was a witch, right? I mean, as far as I'm aware, most witches got burned or hung.
You're quite right. What we have here is a very unique set of circumstances. Lilias Adie died in custody, and the problem was very simple. She'd confessed to being a witch, and she'd also confessed to having renounced her baptism and given her soul to Satan. And it was commonly believed at the time that the devil had the power to reanimate the dead, but witches, of course, couldn't cross running water. So this is a suite of measures to stop the deceased being reanimated, coming back to life, and terrorising the living community.
Oh, poor old Lilias. Well, here she ended up. I guess, is this where she stayed?
Unfortunately not. It's hard to think that the story could get more sad, but it does, because we know in 1852 her grave was actually rifled and pillaged. They removed her skull, her long bones from her legs and her ribs, and quite where any of her remains are now, we simply just don't know.
The Witchcraft Act of 1563 made practising witchcraft or consulting with witches a capital crime. Over the next century and a half, between 4,000 and 6,000 people were tried in Scotland. We'll be finding out the true horror of Lilias Adie's story later. Why was she accused of witchcraft? How did she die? And what happened to her skull and bones? We've been discovering the ingenuity and industrial flair of the people here. But also their susceptibility in the past to superstitious beliefs.
So far, we have a witch's tombstone. We don't know where her bones might be. We're investigating what kind of footfall could have made the Kincardine crossing such a vital ferry service. And we're trying to solve the mystery of Kennetpans Harbor and its derelict buildings.
Old maps tell us that Kennetpans Harbor came into existence sometime between 1590 and 1681, and that before the distillery there were probably other kinds of industry here. But what were they? At the time, the land along this coastline was divided into big estates, rich in resources. Charlotte is meeting Murray Dickey, a historian who's been researching early industry in the area.
The 16th century was the beginning of industrial development in this area, and all of these estates actually are developed around a series of very small harbours. Across on the other side of the river, you've got Higgins Nuke. You've then got the village of Airth with its own harbour, and all of these harbours continue up to Stirling.
So you had little harbours dotted all the way along here?
Way and at that time, sea was the only way to move heavy goods. There were no real roads here until about the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century.
Yeah. What was the industry that was driving these harbours?
It was coal. Underneath us, there's a large number of workable coal seams. And from the 16th century, this was being dug up here and exported out.
Right.
The whole of the Inner Forth estuary was actually exporting great coal. And there was no market for the small coal. The ship owners wouldn't take it. The merchants in London wouldn't buy it.
But there was one industry rapidly developing right here on the Forth that could use it, and that was salt.
It was manna to heaven from the salt panners. They needed a source of heat to heat the pans to evaporate the water. You had salt water out in the estuary here. You had a nice, safe harbour at Kennetpans, and you had a supply of really cheap coal.
So it's quite a busy salt industry, salt panning
A
industry.
busy salt industry and a great important source of revenue to the Crown. 400 or 500 years ago, this would have been a bustling scene with coal miners coming with coal, salters taking salt out. Very, very busy.
So Kennetpans was an industrial hub, with coal and salt regularly shipped out from here. We know the derelict buildings were a distillery and belonged to a later phase of the harbour. But when exactly did the distilling business get started? Oliver is back in George Bruce's hometown, Kouros, which he made prosperous through mining and exporting coal from his underwater moat pit.
Hi, welcome.
Hi.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
This is the place where George Bruce lived, right in the heart of the town. Kouros Palace is now a National Trust for Scotland property, and Oliver's meeting their curator, Antonia Lawrence Allen. She wants to show him a portrait thought to be of George Bruce.
Now, he's a man of slightly advanced years in the painting, but how old was he when he became involved in the colliery?
He was only 25 when he got the lease for the lands. Now, it did help that it was his cousin, Alexander Colville, who gave him the lease. Alexander believes that he is the only one with the skill, the intelligence in machinery to revive the collieries of Kouros that had been mined for centuries by the monks, but had kind of lain to waste for many, many years.
Was it just coal that Sir George was involved in?
Well, yes and no. I mean, coal was the most important thing because it was the power. It powered everything. So he could use it to power the salt panning that he was doing. He was producing huge amounts of salt, which was incredibly valuable for preserving food at the time. He also used the coal to melt iron and make iron products. Kouros had monopoly over making the griddle, which is the pan that the Scots make their bannocks on. So it was an incredibly wealthy income for this family and others in the village.
George Bruce's moat pit turned around the fortunes of Kouros. With its mine making big contributions to the royal coffers, James VI made it a royal borough, which opened up trading links abroad. The whole area was booming, with a thriving coal and salt industry. So how and when did the moat pit fall into disuse? While innovators like George Bruce were modernising Kouros and economic life on the Forth, religious leaders were determined to assert their authority. I'm back on the trail of what happened to Lilias Adie, a woman buried in the Inter-tidal zone at Torryburn in 1704, after being accused of being a witch. In George Bruce's own town, women were being tried and condemned. I'm here to meet Louise Yeoman, a researcher who studied the history of witchcraft.
This is the townhouse at Kouros, and we're in the borough courtroom. We had a lot of witch trials here, and in fact, we're right underneath a witch's prison, which would have been above that amazing painted ceiling.
Do you think Lilias was actually brought here herself?
We've no idea where Lilias was held. Probably in a room like this, she was interrogated, you know, by the Kirk Session of Torryburn.
So when you say Kirk Sessions, Kirk is church?
Kirk is church. Kirk Session is a church court, and it's a court. It normally deals with fornication, social welfare, adultery, but we also get witch cases as well.
So everything that's written down here is really their way of gathering evidence to say, we've got a witch, we need to try her.
Yep.
And I can already see Lilias's name. Where does her story begin?
Well, there's obviously been some kind of feud going on. There's sort of two women who are, you know, accusing Lilias of turning up invisibly and tormenting them. So now she's been brought into the court, Toryburn, 29th July.
That's enough to have her arrested and brought in?
Yes, but here we have, you know, a formal witch confession. She says the devil took her to the side of a stook of corn and caused her renounce her baptism, and then the devil lay with her carnally.
That's an incredibly detailed confession.
I think we're kind of hearing this from the minister who's doing the questioning.
Oh, really?
Who's very keen on burning witches. She's probably been coached. And you'd want to sleep deprive her to the point where she would tell you anything just to make you stop. And the sheer hopelessness she must have felt. You're a dead woman walking if you're brought in like this.
So tragic, because it's kind of immediate. It's like she's just given up.
So she would have been absolutely hated, an outcast. There was no way back for her. And, you know, she dies, and they don't want to put a dead witch in their kirkyard.
And that's why she ends up in the intertidal zone.
That's it.
I know that her grave was robbed and that her skulls and her bones were removed.
Well, her skull got into the hands of an eminent Fife doctor, and he did a little pamphlet on it. There's a picture of her skull. And he decided she had an abnormally small skull, which meant she had a diseased brain. And he says she was probably an epileptic with an excessive development of the religious sentiment.
Any of that in any way verifiable?
Oh, nonsense. She's just a normal pensioner.
Just ordinary, yeah. It's shocking to realise that at the very same time that Scotland was being transformed into a modern industrial society, women like Lilias were the victims of traditional, unenlightened bigotry. Oliver has picked up the baton on our investigation into the 19th century pier we visited earlier. He's with Tom and Ellie on the opposite side of the river to the pier, at Kincardine, where there's a cluster of boat wrecks. What can these boats tell us about the ferry crossing? Will they shed any light on why traffic across the estuary, just here, was so important?
All clear, take off.
Tom has brought along his drone so they can get a closer look at what's there.
All right, yeah, there's one of our boats there, look.
Archaeologist and maritime expert Steve Lisco knows the wrecks, but has come to look at them close up with the help of the drone.
Look on that monitor there.
Come take a look at this.
Right.
Very distinctive shape there.
You see it's got an extremely blunt bow.
Right, OK.
And also the ratio of the width of the boat to its length indicate that it was definitely built to take a heavy load. It's indicative of something that would have a very shallow draft, an almost flat bottom, so you could put tons and tons of weight on it without creating a huge displacement. More than likely, it's been a cattle ferry from the 19th century.
Cattle ferry?
Yeah. Kincardine was a crossing point for cattle drove in the 18th and 19th century, where huge numbers of animals were taken south to Falkirk, down to the cattle markets.
It's such an unusual shape, isn't it? Presumably because it had to be specifically for the cattle.
It's a very broad beam vessel, so you could get quite a few beasts on this at once, and you may get 40 or 50 animals on there.
How do they load them and unload them? It must have been a bit of a process.
Well, here we've got a nice ramped, sloped pier that could be laid alongside, and they'd only have low bulwarks to the vessel, so at most states of the tide they will just walk the cattle onto the deck, or indeed use the bow ramp to load and offload them.
If it's a bit of a rough crossing, they might be quite eager to get off the other end. I mean, is it quite a dangerous job unloading cattle?
Well, I think the drovers knew the business very well, and the cattle will be used to water because in the earlier stages of the drove down to here, they didn't have boats. They would just swim the cattle across. Here's a photograph of the ferry at Carlackie. And basically, it's a big boat that's just been filled up with cattle.
Well, I can see how you would pack the boat now. They're a little bit like beef sardines.
Yeah, very much, very much. Nose to tail.
These These boats seem to provide evidence of a huge commercial business, and the piers were being constantly redesigned to meet the needs of the cattle drovers who used them. But how big was this trade? How did it work? And did the survival of the Higgins Nuke ferry ultimately depend on it? We've been discovering 400 years of enterprise and invention on the Firth of Forth. Innovations that drove technological change, not only here, but across Britain as a whole.
There were lucrative industries, coal, salt, coming out of this relatively small area of the Firth of Forth. Without the people, innovations and pioneering initiatives behind them, Scotland's economy in the 17th, 18th and 19th century could have looked very different.
We're investigating the industrial past of the harbour at Kennetpans and the ruined buildings close by. Charlotte has returned there to meet Brian Frew, who bought the land with his wife Fiona, unaware of its history. After a lot of research, they were surprised to discover the dilapidated buildings were the remains of an 18th century whisky distillery.
Kennetpans is regarded as the birthplace of the Scotch whisky industry.
Why did they specifically choose Kennetpans to build this distillery?
We believe the main reason would be for the port. You've got a sheltered harbour, busy port in its time.
So what's the story behind the distillery? Whose was it?
Probably one of the greatest industrial families in Scotland, but unfortunately one of the least known. The Steens were local farmers. We can trace their roots back to the Kennetpans area to about 1650. Before Kennetpans, distilling was always done for your own consumption or for sale within the local area. Kennetpans is where distilling left the farmyard and became a true industry.
Kennetpans started producing whisky in the 1720s. It was the very first commercial distillery in Scotland. The Steens were innovators, always looking for ways to get ahead of the game.
Oh, wow, look at this.
This is the mill house of the original distillery.
It's huge. And I can't help but notice this huge, great big circle cut into the side of the wall.
That's the location of Scotland's first James Watt steam engine. He wants it for grinding of barley. It was new, it was at the forefront. The Steens were 10 years ahead of the Industrial Revolution in Scotland.
With a steam engine of this size, that must have really pushed their productivity right up.
The levels of production that the Steens achieved down here had never been seen before. But by the 1730s, it was regarded as the largest distillery in Scotland.
Wow.
Several years later, John Steen's brother, James Steen, built a sister distillery a mile distance from here.
Mm-hmm.
At their peak, the Steen family produced over 50% of Scotland's total whisky production.
Wow, that's huge.
The Steens pioneered commercial whisky production, and by the 1780s, they owned 5 distilleries in Scotland and 2 in Ireland. By 1826, another Steen distillery had taken over as the major whisky producer, and Kennetpans closed that year. But was that the end of the harbour's active life too? Back across the river, and in the same decade, another of Scotland's money spinners, the cattle trade, was driving technological change at Higgins Nuke. The third and largest of the piers was built in the 1820s to enable thousands of cattle and their drovers to cross the Firth of Forth. They were on their way to the huge markets known as the Falkirk trysts. By the mid-18th century, these trysts at Falkirk had become the main cattle market in Scotland. I'm at Callendar House, meeting local historian Ian Scott to find out more about them.
These are the kind of cattle we're talking about. So these are smaller, probably half the size of what we would see in a cow in a field today. They were sturdy, they were hardy, a breed of cattle that can survive in this mountainous country and this sort of climate.
Is this the route they took? Or the routes, I should say.
Well, the routes, yeah. This map shows us the complexity of this network of drove roads. Now, these were unmade grassy tracks that had been used for centuries to carry the cattle from every part of the Highlands on the hoof down to the great markets or trysts.
And of course, to get there, you've got to get across the Forth, most of them, they're coming from this area, and I can spot just there the Kincardine ferry.
From the early 19th century, they were putting on special ferries to carry the cattle across to the Falkirk area.
So that they could get their cattle safely to the tryst.
Essential.
At Falkirk. We're talking hundreds of miles.
Hundreds of miles.
So this would have taken weeks and weeks and weeks.
Yes, the drovers, the men who were responsible for taking them safely down to the markets, they had, you know, fairly strict rules with regard to how long they walked. So 10 miles a day was really the maximum. One chap said that if you walk for more than that, it's fair ruin on the bestial, he said. They would lose weight.
Was it just the one tryst, or were there multiple?
There are 3 trysts in Falkirk. In August, September and October 1840, I think in the October tryst, there were 70,000 black cattle and 120,000 sheep exchange hands on that one day.
Oh, that's enormous.
It's phenomenal, really. If we have a look at this document here, the person owning the land is going to make money. Conditions are set out here. For each score of black cattle, 6 pence to be paid by the seller and 3 pence to be paid by the buyer.
So if you've got, what, 70,000 odd cattle and you're getting a kickback of 9 pence on every score or so, then that's an awful lot of pennies.
It's a lot of money, and money was certainly pouring into the local economy. So that's why these Falkirk trysts were such an important activity.
In just one day, the landowners alone were earning the equivalent of 2.5 years' wages for a working man. But in the 1850s, the railways arrived in Scotland and sounded the death knell for the trysts. Rail was a far easier method of transporting cattle down to England. That also meant the end of the Kincardine ferry and the 200-year-old tradition of droving. Oliver is revisiting Kouros to discover what ultimately became of George Bruce's innovative moat pit.
Now, if I have got my bearings right and I know the tide is in, the moat pit, as I remember it, somewhere out that way, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit further over there.
The engineering techniques used by George Bruce heralded the birth of large-scale coal mining across Britain.
What happened to the moat pit?
There was a huge storm in 1625, March 30th, and it just created such a huge sea surge that it submerged the mine completely, and operations never continued. That was it.
That's got to be a huge surge, hasn't it, given that it was, what, 20 feet off the foreshore?
Yeah, I imagine sort of standing there on the platform, and the wave must have just cascaded in, and it went straight down the shaft, straight through the tunnels, and it just completely flooded everything. I don't know if there were any miners in there working at the time, but they didn't stand a chance. So it must have been really quite a dramatic moment, and affected the production and the economics of the area for some time.
George Bruce died 5 weeks after the storm. His pioneering mine shaft in the sea was so badly flooded, it never started up again, and the shaft gradually filled with rock and debris. But Bruce's work made a difference. It paved the way for the development of trade and of the many harbours dotted along the inner part of the Firth of Forth. So what became of our harbour at Kennetpans? We know it was busy with whisky exports till the distillery closed in 1826. Historian Murray Dickey has been doing some research into what happened after that.
Once the distillery closed down, Was that the end of the harbour? What happened to it?
The harbour was still expanding, and they continued to mine and export coal and ironstone right up until 1900. The Man and Coal Company, who had taken over the lease of the coal mines here, had actually had an agreement with the estate that they would completely rebuild this harbour. So this is what you're actually seeing.
I think you can see the way that these timber structures are pushed right up against the stonework. And I think what's happened is they've had to build out into the harbour because they've literally ran out of space.
By 1900, the distillery buildings had fallen out of use, but the port itself was actually at the height of its success. There were jetties built out on both sides, a huge new pier and 2 steam cranes. 2 tramways ran down either side of the harbour, bringing coal from nearby pits to be loaded onto the waiting ships.
But you said it closed in what, 1908? Oh, wait, so what happened?
What happened was very sad. This is a mud harbour, so the ships came in here and they sat on the mud. As long as these ships were wooden, that was more or less okay. By the time you got to the end of the 19th century, iron-plated, riveted ships were starting to arrive here, and they did not survive when the tide went out on the mud. 3 of them went out into the North Sea and sank, and beyond that point in time, all of the little mud-based harbours in this area closed down, and the shipping moved to bigger harbours that had wet docks.
It's so ironic, isn't it? Because you sort of think, you know, that a place that's always been driven by innovation and technology, that was always the driving force behind its expansion. Eventually, that same technological innovation did for it.
Yeah. It started with coal and it ended with coal, but it also had salt and whisky. But as you say, in the end of the day, technology scuppered it.
Harbours and settlements all along the Inner Forth played a vital role in developing the industrial landscape of Britain. Now, twice a day, when the tide goes out, the shoreline bears witness to its industrious and innovative past.